The first time anyone noticed her, she was standing behind a row of wild sunflowers outside the general store, clutching a basket of bread like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The town of Willow Creek was used to chatter, women gossiping over quilts, men hollering across the corral, and the clang of hammers echoing through the valley. But she didn't speak. Folks said she was the quiet sort, one of those souls who carried storms inside but never let the thunder out. The wind rustled through her hair, lifting a few loose strands as she lowered her eyes when anyone looked her way. It was as if her silence was a wall she'd built between herself and the world, brick by careful brick. The cowboy saw her from across the street that afternoon. Dusty boots, broad shoulders, and the kind of tired calm only men who'd seen too many sunsets carried. He'd come into town with the cattle drive, his hat pulled low, spurs jingling softly with each step. He wasn't looking for trouble, nor for company. But something about that still figure by the store door caught him like a hook through the heart. She didn't move, didn't smile, didn't even lift her gaze as he passed by. Yet something inside him, some quiet knowing, said she had a story worth hearing. In the late 1800s, Willow Creek wasn't much more than a few wooden shacks, a church, a saloon, and the sound of wagon wheels crunching over the red dust. The railroad hadn't made its way that far yet, and most who settled there came to hide from something: debts, heartbreak, or the kind of sorrow that made a person disappear without ever leaving. He'd come running from his own ghosts, from a war fought too long and a love buried before its time. She, as the whispers went, had lost her family to fever the winter before. Since then, she lived alone in a cabin near the river bend, tending her small garden and rarely speaking to anyone. The preacher tried once to offer comfort, but she only nodded, eyes fixed on the ground. After that, folks stopped trying. Still, when the cowboy saw her again that evening, walking home beneath the fading light, something stirred in him. The way she moved, quiet but graceful, reminded him of the prairie deer that crossed the meadow at dawn, frightened of everything but still searching for something soft in the world. He followed her at a distance, not out of rudeness but out of instinct, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. The sun had dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the dirt road. Crickets sang from the tall grass. The wind smelled of pine and smoke, and somewhere in that hush between day and night he heard her hum. It was the faintest sound, a tune broken halfway through, like she wasn't used to letting her voice exist. He stopped walking, afraid that any step would steal the sound away. It reminded him of something old, a hymn maybe, one his mother used to sing when he was a boy. When the last note faded into the wind, she turned suddenly as if she'd felt him there. Their eyes met for a brief moment, hers wide and unsure, his steady but kind. Then, before either could speak, she hurried off, her boots barely making a sound against the dirt. That night he couldn't sleep. The saloon's piano rang out across the street, laughter spilling through the doors, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept seeing those eyes, the way they seemed to hold everything she couldn't say. He'd seen pain before, in soldiers and mothers, but this was different. This was someone trapped not by chains but by silence itself. And somehow he wanted to be the one to break it, gently, like sunlight touching frost. The next morning he saddled his horse before dawn. The fog clung to the field, soft and silver. He rode toward the river, where he'd seen her heading the night before. Sure enough, there she was, kneeling by the water, washing a piece of fabric in the cold current. The sight of her alone in the mist struck something deep in him. He cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle her. She froze, then turned slowly, eyes wary but curious. For a moment neither spoke. The river whispered between them. "Mornin'," he said finally, his voice rough from the chill. She looked at him, then nodded once, her lips parting as if to speak but no sound coming out. He smiled faintly. "Didn't mean to bother you. Just thought the view looked better with company." It wasn't much of a line, but it was enough. For the first time she smiled, not wide, but soft, fragile, like the first break of dawn over the hills. Then she looked down again, the shyness washing over her like a tide. He dismounted and sat a few feet away, giving her space. They stayed like that, side by side in silence, listening to the water. He didn't press her for words. He just talked, about the weather, the cattle, the new barn roof at the ranch. It felt strange at first, speaking to someone who never answered. But the longer he spoke, the easier it became. Every now and then, she'd glance up, a small flicker of interest in her eyes, and that was enough to keep him going. Days turned into weeks. He found himself riding by the river more often, always by chance, though both of them knew better. Sometimes she'd bring a loaf of bread to share, other times a handful of wild berries. Slowly something began to change. She still didn't speak, not yet, but she laughed once. A quiet, startled laugh when his hat blew into the river. He caught it just in time, dripping wet, and she covered her mouth, eyes bright with something he hadn't seen before. Joy. It was brief, but it was real. The townsfolk began to notice. Whispers spread through Willow Creek like smoke. The quiet girl by the river and the cowboy who couldn't stop talking. Some said it wouldn't last. Others said it was the kind of love the good Lord himself liked to write into people's lives. He didn't care for talk. He just kept showing up day after day, his voice filling the silence she'd once called home. Then came the storm. It rolled in one night from the west, tearing across the plains with thunder that shook the ground. The river swelled, rising fast, and word spread that her cabin sat too close to the bank. Without a thought, he grabbed his coat and rode into the rain. Lightning split the sky as he reached her door, pounding against it with his fists. When she opened it, drenched and trembling, the look in her eyes said everything words never could. Fear, relief, trust. He took her hand, guiding her outside, shouting over the roar of the storm, "We need to move. Now!" She hesitated, glancing back towards something inside. Maybe her memories, maybe the life she'd built in silence. Then the floorboards cracked beneath her feet, and she finally moved, gripping his hand tight as they ran through the mud toward higher ground. The river swallowed her cabin whole behind them. They collapsed under an old oak, rain beating down like stones. He turned to her, chest heaving. "You're safe," he said. "I've got you." For the first time she spoke. One word, barely a whisper. "Why?" He looked at her, startled by the sound of her voice. It was soft, uncertain, but filled with something real. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, the wind howled louder, shaking the trees. The storm wasn't done yet, and neither was their story. The thunder rolled, and in that wild night, under the endless sky of the old American frontier, two souls who'd lived in silence and sorrow finally found a reason to speak, not with words, but with everything they had left to give. The rest of Willow Creek would soon hear what happened on that hill, but for now, the only thing louder than the storm was the heartbeat between them. The storm passed sometime before dawn, but neither of them noticed when the thunder faded. The cowboy sat with his back against the oak tree, soaked through and shivering, his arm wrapped around her shoulders to keep her warm. The rain had slowed to a whisper, dripping from the leaves above, and a faint gray light was spreading across the valley. She leaned against him, her breathing steady now, though her eyes were fixed on the direction of her cabin, or what used to be her cabin. Smoke rose in the distance, the color of wet ash. She didn't cry. She just watched, quiet as the morning itself, her hands trembling slightly against the folds of his coat. He wanted to say something to comfort her, to fill the silence that hung between them. But words felt too small for what she'd just lost. When the wind carried the smell of soaked earth and broken wood, he finally spoke. "We'll go back once it's safe," he said softly. "See what we can salvage." She gave a small nod, her eyes still distant, as though part of her heart was still standing inside that ruined home. As the sun rose, a few riders from town appeared along the ridge, neighbors and ranch hands coming to check the damage. The cowboys stood and waved, calling out that they were fine. The men dismounted, faces tired and muddy, and one of them looked at the woman with quiet sympathy. "River took half the lower valley," he said. "Some fences gone. A few barns too. Guess you were lucky." She didn't answer, only tightened the blanket around her shoulders. He led his horse down to where the cabin once stood. The walls had given way, and the roof lay twisted in the mud. Her garden was gone, the patch where she grew wildflowers and mint, nothing but brown water now. He saw the pain in her face as she took it all in. It wasn't just a home to her, it was the last piece of her past. Every board had carried her father's hammer marks, every window pane the memory of her mother's touch. The cowboy didn't try to talk her out of that grief. He just stood beside her, hat in hand, letting the silence do what words couldn't. When the wind grew colder, he finally said, "You can stay at the ranch for a while. There's room. Warm fire, dry bed. You shouldn't be out here alone." She turned toward him slowly, uncertain. For someone who'd built her world on keeping distance, the idea of stepping into another's life must have felt like standing too close to a fire. Her lips parted like she wanted to refuse, but instead she whispered a faint, "Thank you." It was only 2 words, yet they carried more weight than 100 others. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The hills still glistened from the storm, and the air smelled of wet sage and pine. She rode behind him, holding on to the saddle horn, her gaze lowered but her grip steady. The horse moved slowly through the muddy trail, and every so often she looked up toward the sky, pale blue now, the kind of calm that only comes after a night that nearly took everything away. When they reached the ranch, the hands had already begun repairing fences and feeding the stock. The place stood strong. Wide corral, smoke rising from the chimney, and the faint sound of a fiddle playing somewhere inside. The cowboy helped her down, and one of the older women who worked the kitchen hurried out to meet them. She took one look at the stranger, soaked and pale, and nodded. "Come on, honey," she said gently. "Let's get you warm." Inside, the fire was already burning. The scent of coffee and wood filled the air. She sat near the hearth, her hands stretched toward the flames, silent as always. The cowboy poured her a cup of coffee and set it beside her. "Don't taste like much," he said with a small smile. "But it'll warm you." She nodded again, murmuring something under her breath that sounded like, "Thank you," though he couldn't be sure. He stepped outside for a while, watching the valley spread below. The ranch had always been his refuge, wide open, honest work, long days under the sun. But now, for the first time in a long while, it felt different. Maybe it was because of her. The quiet girl who'd lost everything and yet somehow still carried herself with a kind of quiet grace that no storm could wash away. That night, as the sky deepened into gold and purple, he found her sitting on the porch, watching the last of the light fade over the hills. He joined her, resting his hat on his knee. "You used to live by the river long?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "My folks built that place," she said softly. "Before the fever came." Her voice was faint but steady, each word careful, like she was still learning how to trust her own sound. He listened quietly as she spoke, for the first time more than a handful of words. She told him about her mother's laughter, her father's strong hands the days before sickness took them both, about how the town's silence afterward was louder than the thunder last night. After they were gone, she said, her gaze distant, I didn't see much reason to talk. Folks had enough noise of their own. He nodded, his eyes thoughtful. Sometimes, he said, it takes the right kind of quiet to hear what really matters. She looked at him then, her expression soft but searching, like she was trying to decide whether to believe him. Over the next few days, she settled into life at the ranch, though she remained shy and careful, like a bird testing whether it could trust a branch. The other hands were kind to her, giving space but offering smiles when they passed. She helped in the kitchen, mended clothes, fed the hens, and tended to a small patch of soil behind the barn where wild herbs began to grow again under her touch. But as the peace returned, so did the whispers, not cruel, just curious. Folks at the saloon spoke of the cowboy's new companion, wondering if she was trouble or blessing. Some said she was haunted. Others said she was the reason the old ranch finally felt alive again. The cowboy didn't answer any of it. He worked harder than ever, up before dawn, back after dark, as if building fences and breaking horses could keep his thoughts from turning to her. But no matter how far he rode, the memory of her voice, quiet, hesitant, real, followed him. One evening he returned from town to find her standing by the corral, her hair loose in the wind, eyes fixed on the horizon. "You been thinking about leaving?" he asked gently. She didn't turn, only said, "I don't belong here." "Not really." He stepped closer. "You belong wherever you're cared for," he said. "And you are here." She looked at him then, her eyes glimmering with something that wasn't quite tears but close. "You don't know me," she said. "Not what I've done. Not what I'm hiding." The words hung heavy between them. He felt his chest tighten. "Then tell me," he said quietly. But she shook her head and walked away toward the barn, leaving him standing under the fading light, the first edge of doubt cutting through his calm. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, he heard the faint creak of a door. He looked out and saw her walking toward the stables, lantern in hand. She moved with purpose, not fear. He followed her quietly until she stopped beside a small chest hidden under the hayloft. She opened it, revealing a stack of old letters wrapped in faded ribbon. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across her hands. She froze. Slowly, she turned toward him, her eyes wide. For a moment, neither spoke. The air felt heavy again, like before a storm. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said softly. "I couldn't sleep," he replied. "And you looked like you were fixin' to run." Her hand tightened on the letters. "These belong to my father," she whispered. But there's something in them that could hurt people. The reason I kept quiet all this time, it wasn't just shyness. The cowboy stepped closer, his voice steady. What kind of hurt? Before she could answer, the lantern flickered, and a gust of wind blew through the open door, scattering dust and straw. She clutched the letters to her chest, eyes full of fear, not of him but of something older, heavier, waiting to be told. He reached out, but she stepped back, shaking her head. "Please," she whispered. "Not yet." He didn't push her. Instead, he took a slow breath and said, "Then I'll wait. But don't run, all right? Not from me." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded faintly, the smallest sign of trust returning to her eyes. As he walked back toward the house, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever secret she carried wasn't just hers. It was tied to Willow Creek itself, to the old scars buried beneath the quiet town. And though the storm outside had passed, he knew another one was building, this time inside both of them. The next morning, the valley was calm again, but something between them had changed. She was distant, watchful, her gaze always drifting toward the hills where the old mine road disappeared into the trees. The cowboy knew better than to ask too soon, but deep down he could feel it. The past she was hiding had just started to wake. And when it did, it would test everything they'd begun to build together. The days that followed were quiet on the surface, but underneath that calm, something heavy began to stir. The woman went about her chores as if nothing had changed, feeding the hens, drawing water from the well, tending to the herbs behind the barn, but her eyes betrayed her. They no longer looked at the world, only through it, the cowboy noticed. Every time he tried to speak with her, she'd find a reason to step away. He didn't blame her. Folks who carried secrets often needed space to breathe. But still, it weighed on him, the feeling that she was slipping away into some shadow that no one else could reach. The letters she'd clutched that night never left her side. He saw her reading them by lantern light after supper, her fingers tracing each line as though trying to read between the words. Sometimes he'd pass the open window and hear her whispering softly, the sound of her voice tangled with the creak of the wind outside. She was afraid of something, not someone, but something tied to her past, and the more he thought about it, the more the unease grew in him. The next time he rode into town for supplies, he asked around. Not direct questions, he knew better than that, but little pieces woven into small talk over coffee and tobacco. An old ranch hand said her father once worked the gold mine up north, back when Willow Creek was still growing. Another remembered how the man had left town after an argument with the sheriff, taking his wife and little girl with him. They said he was sitting on something big, the man said, lowering his voice. Something folks would kill to keep quiet. That night, the cowboy sat by the fire at the ranch, the flames dancing low. He didn't know whether to believe the stories or not. The mines had been shut down for years, after a collapse buried half a dozen men. Folks said it was an accident, but in a place like Willow Creek, truth often came wrapped in dust and silence. If her father had known something worth hiding, it might explain the fear in her eyes every time someone mentioned the town's name. He found her by the barn later that night, staring out at the horizon where the moonlight spilled across the valley. "I heard some things," he said quietly. "About your father." She stiffened but didn't turn. "They say he worked the mines, that he left town fast." Her hands gripped the wooden railing until her knuckles turned white. "They say a lot of things," she murmured. "Most of them aren't true." He waited, but she said nothing more. The crickets filled the silence between them. Finally, she looked over her shoulder. "He wasn't running," she said softly. "He was protecting something. Someone." Before he could ask, she walked away, leaving him with more questions than answers. A few days later, the town's sheriff rode out to the ranch. He was a tall man with a gray mustache and eyes like flint. The cowboy met him at the gate. "You've got company living here now," the sheriff said, tipping his hat toward the house. "Quiet girl. Folks been asking about her. Since when's that a crime?" the cowboy asked. "Since she showed up and started stirring up old dust," the sheriff replied. "That mine business, some people don't want it remembered. You might want to tell her that." He turned his horse and rode off before the cowboy could answer. That evening, when he told her what the sheriff said, she went pale. "They can't find out," she whispered. "If they do, they'll destroy everything my father died for." Her voice trembled, but her eyes were steady now, lit with something fierce. "Promise me you won't tell anyone about the letters," he hesitated. "You don't trust me yet, do you?" "I don't trust anyone," she said quietly. That's how I've stayed alive. She turned to leave, but he caught her arm gently. Then let me help you stay that way, he said. She looked at him for a long time, then nodded once, as if the fight inside her had finally met someone willing to share the burden. From that moment, he was part of it, whatever it was. The tension around town started to rise like heat before a storm. Two strangers arrived a few days later, men with city clothes and hard eyes. They asked questions at the saloon about old mining claims and missing ledgers. Someone said they rode up toward the river that evening. The cowboy didn't like it one bit. He could feel the edges closing in. That night, he went down to the barn where she'd hidden the chest. We need to move those letters, he told her. If someone's looking for them, this is the first place they'll check. She shook her head. They're safer here than anywhere else. My father hid the truth inside those pages. If the wrong people get them, they'll twist it for their own gain. What truth? He asked again. What did he find? She hesitated, then knelt beside the chest. Her fingers brushed the ribbon, and she took out one letter, yellowed and thin. He discovered the mine wasn't closed because of an accident, she said. The collapse was planned. The owners wanted to cover up what they found. He frowned. What did they find? She looked up at him, eyes glimmering in the lantern light. Not gold, she said, bodies. Native families forced into the tunnels, used as laborers when no one was supposed to know. When the truth started spreading, they buried it, literally. The cowboy felt the weight of her words settle deep inside him. He'd heard stories like that before, rumors of greed, cruelty, and lies. But hearing it now, seeing how it had shaped her life, made it real. Your father tried to expose them. She nodded. He gathered proof, letters, statements, even a map of where the bodies were buried. But before he could send it to the governor, men came for him. My mother, she tried to stop them. That's when the fever started, or so they said. Her voice broke then, and for a moment, she wasn't the quiet, mysterious woman anymore, just someone who'd lost too much too soon. The cowboy put a hand on her shoulder. You think those men in town are connected? I know they are, she said. They're looking for what my father left behind. They don't want the world to know what happened here. Outside, the wind howled softly against the boards. He could feel the danger creeping closer, like the rumble of hooves before a stampede. Then we'll have to be ready, he said. The following morning, he rode into town early. The streets were nearly empty, but he could feel eyes on him from behind curtained windows. At the general store, the old clerk leaned over the counter and whispered, You best watch yourself, son. Folks are saying you're keeping company with trouble. Maybe I am, the cowboy replied. But trouble's got a way of finding the right people to stand beside. As he left the store, he spotted the two strangers at the edge of town, talking to the sheriff. One of them looked up, meeting his gaze for a long, cold moment. The message was clear. We know who you are and we know what you're hiding. He rode back fast, dust trailing behind him. The valley stretched out quiet and golden, but his gut told him peace wouldn't last long. When he reached the ranch, she was already waiting by the porch holding one of the letters. They were here, she said. 2 men. Asked the cook if I'd come from the mine road. He dismounted, jaw tightening. Then they're getting close. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. They won't stop until they find the map. He paused. You said your father hid it. Where? Her eyes flickered toward the hills beyond the corral. He buried it near the old church ruins. It's marked with a stone shaped like a cross. He studied her face for a moment. Then we'd better get to it first. They rode out at dusk, the light fading behind them, the air thick with the scent of rain and danger. The road wound through old oak trees and tall grass that brushed their boots. When they reached the church ruins, the place was silent. Too silent. The cowboy dismounted and scanned the shadows. Stay close, he whispered. They searched near the collapsed wall, the ground damp from last night's storm. After a few minutes, her hand brushed against something hard beneath the soil. She knelt, digging carefully until the shape of a small metal tin appeared. This is it, she breathed. But before they could open it, a branch cracked nearby. The cowboy spun around, hand on his revolver. 2 silhouettes stood just beyond the trees, watching. One of them stepped forward, the same man from town, his eyes glinting in the fading light. Looks like you found what we were looking for, the man said. The woman froze, clutching the tin to her chest. The cowboy took a step forward, his voice low and calm. You'll have to go through me first. The man smiled, cold and certain. That can be arranged. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain again. The first drop fell between them, darkening the dust. The woman's breath caught in her throat. The cowboy didn't move. The storm was coming back, only this time it wasn't made of rain. And whatever truth lay buried beneath that church, it was about to surface, one way or another. The air between them was tight enough to break. The cowboy stood in the clearing, one hand hovering near his revolver, the other raised just slightly toward the woman, wordlessly telling her to stay back. The men across from them didn't flinch. The taller one, with the sharp jaw and city boots, took another step forward, his coat brushing the wet grass. "You don't understand what you've got there," he said, his voice low but edged with threat. "That map doesn't belong to you. Hand it over, and we'll let you both walk away." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "That map belongs to the truth," he said. "And the truth's been buried long enough," the man smirked, tilting his head. "Truth doesn't feed you, cowboy. It doesn't keep your ranch standing. Sometimes the best thing a man can do is leave the past where it lies." Rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, soaking through their coats. The woman clutched the tin to her chest, her knuckles white. Every muscle in her body was tight as a drawn bow. She wasn't used to standing in the open like this, with danger staring her down. But something in her eyes had changed. She'd run from her past for years, but now she looked ready to fight for it. The shorter man reached for his belt, and the cowboy's hand went to his revolver. A heartbeat passed, maybe less, and the tension snapped like a whip. "Don't," the cowboy said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean through the rain. "You fire that gun, you'd better be sure." The taller one held up a hand, motioning for his partner to stop. "We ain't here to shoot," he said slowly. "But make no mistake, we will get what we came for. That map doesn't change anything. Those mines are ours, same as they've always been." The cowboy's eyes narrowed. "Not if people find out what's under them." The man smiled again, cruel this time. "You really think anyone in Willow Creek wants to hear that story? You dig too deep, cowboy. You'll find yourself buried right alongside her father." He turned and walked away into the rain, his partner following close behind. The sound of their boots faded down the hill, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the hammering of the storm. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The woman's breath came in quick, uneven bursts, her heart pounding so loud she thought it might burst. When she finally looked up at the cowboy, her voice shook. "They'll be back. I know," he said. "But next time, we'll be ready." They wrapped the tin in his saddle blanket and rode hard for the ranch, the storm chasing them all the way down the valley. The hills flashed white with lightning, and thunder rolled like cannon fire. By the time they reached the barn, both horses were foaming at the mouth, their coats slick with rain. The cowboy lifted her down gently, his hand steady even though his pulse wasn't. "Get inside," he said. "I'll take care of the horses." She hesitated. "You think they'll follow us here?" "I think they already are." That night, the ranch didn't sleep. He set up lanterns near the barn and loaded his rifle, keeping it close by the window. The rain softened into a cold drizzle, and fog began to roll across the fields. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every creak of the wood made her flinch. She sat by the hearth, holding one of her father's letters, tracing the ink with trembling fingers. "He died for this," she whispered. "And now it's starting all over again." The cowboy turned toward her, his face lit by the faint orange glow of the fire. "He didn't die for paper," he said quietly. "He died because he believed folks deserve the truth. Don't let his story die with fear." She looked at him for a long moment, her lips pressed tight. "I'm not afraid," she said. "Not anymore." But when the wind slammed against the window, she jumped. By morning, the rain had stopped. The valley looked calm again, but it was the kind of calm that came before something worse. Tracks in the mud near the fence line told him everything he needed to know. They'd been there during the night, watching, waiting. He gathered the ranch hands and told them to keep their eyes open. But he didn't mention the map. The fewer who knew, the safer they'd all be. The woman helped in the kitchen, her face pale but determined. She didn't speak much, but she listened. To the wind, to footsteps, to the subtle changes in the air. She could feel danger getting closer, like a storm circling back around. That evening, he found her sitting near the stables again, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold. "They'll come through the hills next time," he said. "Not the road. How do you know?" she asked. "Because that's what I'd do." She nodded, understanding. Her eyes wandered to the horizon where the sky burned gold against the mountains. "What happens if we lose?" He looked at her, his voice firm. "Then we make sure the world knows why we tried." For a long while they said nothing. The world seemed to hold its breath around them. The next day, trouble finally showed its face. A rider came tearing down the road from town, shouting that the sheriff was missing. His horse was found near the mine entrance, reins torn, saddle empty. Folks were already whispering that it wasn't an accident. The cowboy's gut twisted. He knew what that meant. The men from the city had made their move. He and the woman packed what they needed, food, matches, the letters and the map, and set out before sundown. "We can't stay," he said. "They'll burn this place if they think we're hiding anything." She looked back at the ranch, her eyes soft with something like regret. It was starting to feel like home. He gave a faint smile. "Home's wherever you're still breathing." They rode north through the canyon, following the old trail her father used years ago. The path was narrow, the cliffs rising high on both sides, the air heavy with the scent of pine and stone. Every sound echoed. The rhythm of the horses' hooves against the wet ground was the only thing breaking the silence. As night fell, they stopped near a creek to rest. He built a small fire, careful to keep the flames low. She sat beside him, pulling the letters from her coat. "There's one thing I never told you," she said. "My father wasn't the only one who kept records. He sent copies somewhere safe. He said if anything ever happened, the map would lead to the rest." The cowboy frowned. "You know where?" She nodded slowly. "The old mine itself." He looked at her sharply. "You're saying he hid proof inside the place they tried to bury?" "Yes," she said. "And that's why they'll do anything to stop us from getting there." The fire crackled softly, the light flickering across their faces. "Then we've got one chance," he said. "We get there first." They left before dawn, the mist curling around their horses like ghosts. The trail wound higher into the hills, past dead trees, and the remains of old mining camps long abandoned. The closer they got, the heavier the air became, filled with the smell of iron and wet rock. When they finally reached the ridge, the sun was just breaking through the clouds, painting the world in cold gold. Below them lay the mouth of the mine, dark, half-collapsed, and silent. The entrance looked like a wound in the earth, raw and waiting. The woman shivered. "I haven't been here since the day it happened," she said, when the ground gave way. The cowboy dismounted, scanning the area. "If those men are still around, they'll be watching this place." As if on cue, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a reflection from metal in the brush across the ravine. A rifle barrel. "Down!" he hissed, pulling her behind a boulder just as a shot cracked through the morning air. The bullet slammed into the rock inches from her head. She gasped, clutching his arm. "They're already here." "I know," he said, reloading his revolver. "Stay low." More shots echoed, sharp and fast, bouncing off the stone walls of the canyon. Dust and debris filled the air. The horses reared, panicking, but the cowboy managed to calm them enough to keep them from bolting. He peeked over the rock, catching sight of two figures moving toward the mine entrance. "They're not just guarding it," he said. "They're digging something up." The woman's eyes widened. "They must have found part of the tunnel. If they get inside before us, they won't," he said firmly. They waited until the shooting slowed, then made their move. Keeping to the shadows, they slipped down the ridge, mud slick under their boots. The air was damp and cold, filled with the echo of dripping water. The mine loomed closer, dark and hollow like the mouth of some sleeping beast. Just as they reached the edge, a voice rang out behind them. "Don't move!" They froze. The tall man from before stepped out from the brush, gun aimed steady at the cowboy's back. "I told you this wasn't your fight," he said. "You should have listened." The woman clutched the tin tighter, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The cowboy didn't turn around. "You keep saying that," he said, "but you keep showing up like it's yours." The man smirked. "Oh, it is. My father built this mine. Everything buried here belongs to me." "Then maybe you should step inside," the cowboy said, his tone calm but his eyes sharp. "See what your family left behind." For a moment, no one moved. Then thunder rolled in the distance, low and far off, but the sky above was clear. It wasn't thunder. It was the ground itself, shifting under years of weight and lies. A deep rumble came from inside the mine, followed by a crack that split the silence. The earth trembled beneath their boots. The woman's breath caught. "It's collapsing again," she cried. The cowboy grabbed her arm, pulling her back just as the entrance gave a shudder. The tall man stumbled forward, his gun slipping from his hand as the ground crumbled beneath him. the air filled with dust and the roar of falling stone. The cowboy shielded her as the world around them shook, the old mind finally giving way under the weight of everything it had hidden. When the sound began to fade, and the dust settled enough to breathe, they were still alive, but the mine entrance was gone, buried once more, and somewhere beneath it, so was the truth they'd risked everything to uncover. The woman turned toward the cowboy, her face pale, streaked with dirt and tears. "What do we do now?" she whispered. He looked at the collapsed hillside, then back at her, his voice steady despite the chaos still ringing in his ears. "We keep digging," he said, "because someone has to." And in the distance, where the valley met the horizon, the first storm clouds began to gather again. The dust took hours to settle. The cowboy and the woman sat side by side against a boulder, the sound of crumbling stone echoing through the canyon like the last breath of the mine. The world had gone still again. No voices, no gunfire, just the soft sigh of the wind through the pines. Their faces were streaked with dirt and rain, their hands raw and trembling, but they were alive. The mine was gone for good this time, buried under tons of rock and time. Whatever secrets it had held were buried with it. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The woman stared at the collapsed entrance, her eyes hollow but calm, as if she'd been expecting this all along. "It's over," she said quietly. The cowboy glanced at her, shaking his head. "No," he replied softly. "It's just buried again. But buried things have a way of finding daylight sooner or later." She gave a small, tired smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Then maybe it's better if it stays where it is. Too much truth can burn what's left of a place." He understood what she meant. Willow Creek wasn't ready for what lay beneath that mine. The town had lived too long on half-told stories and silence. Exposing the truth now would tear open wounds that had barely scarred. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that her father's work deserved more than to be swallowed by the earth. As the sky began to clear, they gathered what was left of their supplies and made their way back toward the valley. The path was rough, scattered with fallen branches and loose stone. Each step felt heavier than the last. When they finally reached the ridge overlooking the ranch, the sun was breaking through the clouds, painting the wet fields in soft gold. Smoke curled from the chimney. Someone had kept the fire going. The ranch hands met them halfway, relief spreading across their faces when they saw the pair alive. The cook rushed forward, fussing over the woman, brushing dirt from her hair and whispering prayers under her breath. The cowboy simply nodded, too exhausted for words. He handed off the horses and walked to the porch, his boots sinking into the mud. From there, he looked back at the hills, the place where truth and danger had nearly swallowed them both. That night, the rain returned, softer now, more forgiving. The woman sat by the fire again, her hands wrapped around a blanket. The cowboy joined her, his eyes fixed on the flames. For a while, the only sound was the crackle of the logs. Then she spoke, her voice faint but steady. "My father used to say the truth always outlives the lie. Even if people forget, the earth remembers." He nodded slowly. "Maybe it's not about shouting it loud," he said. "Maybe it's about passing it quietly. One honest soul at a time." She looked at him then, something new flickering in her eyes. A mix of sorrow and peace. "You think that's enough?" "I think it has to be," he said. "You can't build a life in the ashes of what's gone. You start where you stand." Outside, the thunder rolled far away, fading toward the horizon. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment. For the first time in years, her shoulders weren't hunched like she was carrying the weight of something unseen. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It felt warm, earned. Over the next few days, the town began to settle again. News of the sheriff's death reached them, but no one spoke openly about it. The two strangers were never seen again. Some said they'd ridden east. Others claimed they'd been caught in the collapse. No one dared to dig to find out. The people of Willow Creek, for all their curiosity, had a strange way of letting some stories die quietly. The cowboy fixed the fences, helped the hands mend the roof, and slowly brought the ranch back to its rhythm. The woman worked in the garden, her hands finding peace in the soil again. Each morning she'd hum softly, the same broken tune he'd once heard by the river. Only now the melody had found its end. It didn't fade halfway like before. It carried full and whole across the quiet hills. One afternoon, as they worked side by side near the corral, she said, "I've been thinking about rebuilding." He looked up. "The cabin." She nodded. "Not where it was. Higher ground near the pines. I want to plant something new there." He smiled faintly, wiping sweat from his brow. "You should. Nothing wrong with new beginnings." She hesitated, watching him. "You'd help me, wouldn't you?" He met her gaze, steady and sure. "I reckon I'd help you with anything you asked." They built the new cabin together over the next few weeks. Nothing fancy, just a small porch, a single chimney, and walls that caught the morning light. She planted wildflowers around the edge, the same kind that once grew outside her old home. Each one seemed to take root like it knew it belonged. The place felt alive, peaceful. Sometimes at sunset, they'd sit on the porch watching the sky turn red over the hills. He'd tell her stories of his travels, of the wars and towns he'd passed through, and she'd listen with that quiet look of hers, the one that saw deeper than most. She didn't talk much about her past anymore, and he didn't ask. Some things were better left in the hush of memory, but one evening, as the crickets began to sing, she pulled something from her coat pocket, the old tin box. "I kept one letter," she said. "Just one." She opened it and handed it to him. The paper was fragile, edges worn, the ink faded but still legible. It was her father's handwriting. He read the words carefully. "If you're reading this, it means the truth survived longer than I did. Don't fight to make people see it. Just live in a way that proves it was real." The cowboy folded the letter gently, staring out across the valley. "He was a wise man," he said quietly. She nodded. "He was a good man, too. I think that's the part people forget first." They sat in silence after that, the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. The stars began to rise above them, and for the first time since she'd come to Willow Creek, she didn't feel like she was hiding from the world. She felt part of it again, like she belonged to the same land that had tried to bury her. Weeks turned into months. The ranch prospered again. The crops came in strong, and the valley bloomed brighter than anyone could remember. People began to whisper new stories. One's not about ghosts or hidden gold, but about a quiet woman and a cowboy who'd rebuilt something that had been broken. Sometimes, travelers passing through would stop at the new cabin, asking for water or directions. The woman would greet them kindly, her voice no longer hesitant. They'd leave with a smile, unaware of the history buried just beyond the ridge. The cowboy would watch from the corral, tipping his hat as they rode off, proud of the peace she'd found. On the first spring morning after the snow melted, he rode down to the riverbank, the place he'd first seen her, standing silent among the wildflowers. The water shimmered in the sun, carrying pieces of the mountains with it. She joined him a few moments later, her dress catching the light, her hair loose and free. "Funny," she said softly. "It all started right here." He looked at her, a slow smile tugging at his lips. "And somehow we're still standing." She laughed, a sound so pure and unexpected that it echoed through the valley like music. "You talked enough for both of us," she teased. "Maybe that's what kept us alive," he chuckled. "Maybe it was you finally learning to talk back." They stood there for a while, watching the river move steady and strong, the way life always does after a storm. The hills around them were green again, the kind of green that only comes after surviving something harsh. As the breeze swept across the valley, carrying the scent of pine and soil, she took his hand, steady, sure, no longer trembling. There were no more words to be said, no more ghosts left to chase. The past had found its rest, and the future had quietly taken its place. The cowboy looked at her, his voice soft. "So what now?" She smiled, eyes glinting like morning light. "Now we live," she said. "That's all my father ever wanted." He nodded, squeezing her hand gently as the river shimmered beside them. The sun rose higher, spilling gold across the land, and for the first time in years, Willow Creek felt like home again. That small corner of the old American frontier where storms had buried truth and silence had once ruled. Two people who had lost everything found what the world had almost forgotten: peace, and the quiet kind of love that doesn't need to be loud to last forever.